The trophy was supposed to be untouchable. Glass case, public exhibition, guards close enough to make everyone feel civilized. And then it vanished. My dear friend, before the Queen ever placed the Jules Rimet Trophy into the captain's hands at Wembley, England had already lost it. Not in the final, not on a pitch, in a room. That is the part the famous photograph does not confess. The image everyone remembers is clean. The Queen in white gloves, the captain in an England shirt, the golden trophy passing between them after a 4-2 victory over West Germany. It looks like order. It looks like destiny. It looks like a nation finally being crowned in the game it believed it had given to the world. But palaces have trained me to distrust perfect pictures. Because a perfect picture usually means someone has cleaned the room before you were allowed inside. In 1966, the World Cup came to England, wrapped in ceremony. It brought television cameras, royal boxes, politicians, mascots, old pride, new embarrassment, and one very inconvenient fact. The most desired trophy in football had proved easier to steal than anyone wished to admit. So tonight, we are not opening this archive merely to ask who won the World Cup. The score is easy. The harder question is what that moment was trying to crown. Was the monarch honoring a football captain? Was the captain carrying a nation that needed to feel powerful again? Or, for one brief afternoon at Wembley, did football receive its own crown from a monarchy that understood exactly where history was looking? If that is the kind of question you like finding behind a closed door, stay close, my dear friend. Subscribe and leave your like if you want this archive too. Keep opening every other day. Now, before Wembley became a photograph, the trophy had to disappear. The first room was not Wembley. It was quieter than that. No roar, no singing, no white shirts running across a pitch. Just a public exhibition in London, a glass case, and a trophy placed where respectable people could admire it from a safe distance. The Jules Rimet Trophy was not large. That surprises people. Memory enlarges sacred objects. It gives them shoulders, height, thunder. But the actual trophy could be held in two hands, almost tenderly, as if football had chosen to hide its greatest ambition inside. Something small enough to steal. And in March of 1966, someone did exactly that. They stole it. My dear friend, there are few things more embarrassing to an institution than losing the symbol it has. Dressed for ceremony. A crown can survive a war. A palace can survive scandal. But an empty display case has a particular cruelty to it. It does not argue. It does not defend itself. It simply stands there and says, something you called untouchable was touched. England was preparing to host the World Cup. The tournament was supposed to arrive like a procession. Flags, cameras, matches, officials, speeches, the world looking toward the country that had given football so much of its glamour. And then, before the first whistle of the tournament, the prize disappeared from under England's nose. Imagine the room after they understood. Not the public version, not the clipped statement, not the polished sentence prepared for the press. The room. A few men in suits trying not to look frightened. A security arrangement suddenly being remembered in painful detail. Someone asking who had the key. Someone else asking who had been standing where. A door. A corridor. A gap in attention wide enough for history to walk through. I have seen that look in great houses. Not panic. They are trained not to panic. Something colder. The moment when people with authority realize authority has failed in front of witnesses. That is why the theft matters. Not because it changed the result of the tournament. Not because the thief became the hero of the story. He did not. It matters because it cracked the glass before the photograph was ever taken. The World Cup of 1966 is remembered in England as a summer of glory. Fair enough. England won. He lifted the trophy. She stood at the center of the final ceremony. The country received an image so clean it could be hung on the wall of national memory and left there for decades. But that image began with absence. A missing trophy. A shaken football association. A country forced, for several humiliating days, to admit that the object it was preparing to worship had simply been carried away. There is something almost impolite about it. A thief did what wars, politics, and rival nations could not do in that moment. He made the great ceremony look vulnerable. And vulnerability is dangerous before a crowd arrives. Because a sporting tournament can pretend to be only a sporting tournament when the ball is moving. Once the symbol disappears, everyone understands there is more at stake. The trophy was not just metal. It was permission. It was proof. It was the object the host nation hoped to place, at the end of the summer, into English hands. Without it, the stage looked exposed. The royal box could be polished. The flags could be hung. The cameras could be prepared. But somewhere inside the machinery of the event, a quiet fear had entered. What if the great summer became
a joke? What if England, the country so proud of football's old inheritance, could not even guard the prize?
That is the first door of this story. Not the tunnel at Wembley. Not Bobby looking up toward the Queen. Not the roar after the final whistle. An empty space where the trophy should have been. And if you want to understand why the photograph of More and Elizabeth became so powerful, you must begin there. With the missing object. With the embarrassment. With the institution caught, for a moment, without its costume. Because when the Jules Rimet returned to public life, it did not return as an ordinary trophy. It returned as a rescued relic. And by the time he climbed those steps at Wembley, the country was not only watching a captain receive a prize, it was watching a symbol survive its own disappearance. But before we return to the hands, the gloves, and the gold between them, we need to look at the portrait England wanted the world to see in 1966. Because every crack looks different once you know what it was trying to hide. The portrait England wanted in 1966 was simple. Too simple, perhaps. A host nation. A home. World Cup. A royal presence waiting at the end of the tournament like a seal pressed into wax. The countries that had helped give football its rules would welcome the world, defeat the world, and then receive the game's highest symbol beneath the eyes of its own queen. Very tidy. History is rarely that courteous. By the middle of the 1960s, Britain was living with a strange discomfort. It still carried itself like a great house, but some of the rooms had already been closed. The old empire was no longer the empire people had been taught to imagine. The war had been won, yes, but victory had not preserved everything. We had rearranged the furniture. Power was changing shape. The country still had ceremony. It still had uniforms, anthems, processions, royal boxes, and that particular British talent for making decline appear well-dressed. But beneath the polish, there was a question the official portrait preferred not to ask too loudly. What was Britain now? Not in the speeches, in the bones. The World Cup offered a tempting answer. Football was not aristocratic in the way a coronation was aristocratic. It did not belong to a drawing room. It belonged to terraces, factories, pubs, schoolyards, wet Saturdays, fathers and sons, boys kicking balls against them brick walls until the neighbors complained. That made it dangerous and useful. A crown looks strongest when it can stand beside something the people already love. I do not mean that cynically, my dear friend. Not entirely. Public rituals can be sincere and strategic at the same time. A palace can feel the crowd and still understand the value of being photographed near it. She had learned that lesson early. Her coronation in 1953 was not only a sacred ritual, it was a television event. Millions watched monarchy enter their homes through a screen, and once that happened, the crown understood. A modern truth: distance could no longer be its only source of power. It had to appear. At the right hour, in the right place, beside the right symbol. Wembley in 1966 offered all three. There was the stadium, large enough to feel national. There was the tournament, global enough to feel historic. There was the English team, carrying the uncomfortable burden of representing the country that had shaped the game but had never won its greatest prize. That last detail mattered. England did not arrive at the World Cup as a small football nation hoping for a miracle. England arrived as the host with an old claim. The game felt tucked in some emotional and slightly possessive corner of the national imagination, like something that had once belonged to them. But the world had learned it, improved it, challenged them at it. That is what children do. With inheritances, by the way. They take what the old house gives them and then make the old house nervous. So the summer carried pressure long before the final. Every match was more than a match. Every camera was more than a camera. Every cheer had a little history folded inside it. And then there was he. He was not royal. He did not need to be. That was precisely the point. More came from Barking, from the East End of London, from a world of work rather than titles. He carried himself with a calm that people often mistake for lack of emotion. It was not lack of emotion. It was control. The kind of control that makes other men trust you when a room or a stadium begins to lose its shape. On the field, Moore gave England something the country badly wanted to see in itself: composure under pressure. Off the field, the Queen represented something older: continuity, restraint, the promise that the house still stood even when the weather changed. Put them together and the image begins to explain its own power. The Queen and the captain, the crown and the game, the old institution and the popular hero. The official portrait was waiting for them before either one reached the final steps. But portraits, as I have told you, are polite lies. They choose the angle. They choose the lighting. They decide what will remain outside the frame. And outside the frame of England's grand summer, something had already gone wrong. The trophy had not behaved like a sacred object. It had behaved like an object, small, portable, unguarded enough, human enough to vanish. That was the first crack in the portrait. And the crack had a name, a timeline, and one of the strangest recoveries in World Cup history. The crack began in March. Not with a tackle, not with a German forward, not with a mistake by Bobby. With a display case. The Jules Rimet Trophy had been placed on public exhibition in London before the tournament. It was there to be admired, of course, but also to do what sacred objects do for institutions. Reassure people that the ceremony is real, because the object is real. You can see it. Therefore, you can believe in it. That is an old trick. Crowns do it, scepters do it, thrones do it, wedding jewels do it. The object sits still, and everyone around it behaves as if stillness means control. Then someone broke the spell. The trophy disappeared from the exhibition, and suddenly the grand summer had a hole in it. The authorities searched. The newspapers had a feast. The Football Association found itself in the awkward position of hosting the world while not knowing where the world's prize had gone. There are humiliations that make noise, my dear friend, and there are humiliations that make paperwork. This one made both. A demand for ransom appeared. Police were involved. Questions multiplied. How had it happened? Who had then taken it? Was it safe? Could the tournament continue with its central symbol missing? In palaces, people often fear scandal because scandal exposes appetite. Affairs, debts, betrayals, secret letters. Those are human, almost understandable. But this was worse in one very specific way. It exposed incompetence. The room had failed. The guards had failed. The assumption that important things remain important simply because important people say so had failed. And then history, with its usual lack of respect for dignity, handed the case to a dog. Pickles, a black and white collie walking with his owner in South London, came across a package under a hedge. Wrapped in newspaper, according to the story that became part of World Cup folklore, was the missing Jules Rimet Trophy, not recovered by a royal guard, not discovered in a diplomatic chamber, not returned after a brilliant operation by men in dark coats whispering into telephones, found by Pickles, under a hedge. I know, it sounds almost too impolite to be true, and yet it is precisely the kind of detail that makes history feel less like marble and more like a room someone forgot to clean. The trophy was rescued. Pickles became famous. The owner received attention and reward. England exhaled. But relief is not the same as innocence restored. Once a symbol has been stolen, it never returns quite the same. It returns with a story attached, a scratch in the polish, a memory people laugh at, because laughter is kinder than admitting how close the ceremony came to absurdity. And that is why Pickles belongs in this archive. Not because the dog understood power, of course not, but because the incident made power visible. The Jules Rimet was supposed to represent global football's highest honor. In England, that summer, it also carried something more private, the hope that the host country could take back the game's center stage. The trophy was the object everyone wanted to see in English hands. Before that could happen, it had to be found in a hedge. That should make us pause. Because the story of 1966 is often told as a straight road to glory. Host nation, dramatic final, royal presentation, captain lifting trophy. A clean march. But the real road was messier. First came embarrassment, then recovery, then relief. Only then could the ceremony begin rebuilding itself. And institutions are very good at rebuilding ceremony. Give them enough time, enough fabric, enough cameras, enough confident voices, and they can make almost honey brews look like part of the design. By July, the missing trophy had become a story people could smile about. The absurdity had been softened. The danger had been folded into folklore. The object was back, and because it was back, everyone could pretend the spell had never really broken. But it had. For a few days, England learned something it did not want to know. The world's most desired football trophy was not protected by destiny. It was protected by arrangements. And arrangements fail. That lesson did not stay inside the exhibition hall. It moved into the tournament itself, into the broadcasts, the branding, the politics, the way the entire summer had to be packaged for a country and a world watching more closely than ever before. Because once a symbol has embarrassed you, you become very careful about how the next symbol is shown. And in 1966, the next great display case was not made of glass. It was television. Television is a peculiar kind of palace. It has rooms everyone can enter, but only after someone else. has chosen the angle. In 1966, that mattered more than people realized. The World Cup was no longer only a tournament for those who could sit in the stadium, read the papers the next morning, or hear how the match retold in a pub by a man who made himself more heroic with every pint. It was becoming a shared image, a national room. Families gathered around screens. The match entered sitting rooms. The same kick, the same save, the same argument could be watched by people who had never come within sight of Wembley. And the camera, my dear friend, is not a neutral servant. It chooses what becomes memory. One of the great little revolutions of that tournament was the growing use of action replays. Today, we barely notice them. We expect the camera to return, slow down, prove, accuse, forgive, and reopen the wound. But in 1966, replay had a different kind of magic. It taught the public to look twice. That is dangerous. Once a nation learns to look twice, ceremony has to work harder. A goal was no longer only a shout and a rumor. It could be seen again. A foul could be argued with evidence. A moment could be replayed until it stopped, being a moment and became a case. Football was entering the age of the witness. The palace understood this long before sport admitted it. Monarchy had already learned the lesson through coronations, broadcasts, carefully staged appearances. If the public cannot be kept outside the room, then the room must be arranged before the public enters. The World Cup did the same. It arranged itself. It gave the tournament a face. World Cup Willie, the first official mascot of the competition. A lion in a Union Jack shirt. Cheerful, marketable, safe enough for children, useful enough for adults, and patriotic enough to make the whole thing feel less like administration and more like festival. Do not dismiss a mascot too quickly. A mascot is a small flag with a smile. It turns an event into something that can be bought, worn, remembered, repeated. It softens power. It makes branding look innocent. The trophy had vanished from a glass case. Now the tournament needed better containers. Television, merchandise, headlines, ceremony, repetition. And yet, outside the bright frame, not everyone had been invited into the picture. The World Cup of 1966 carried a political shadow that is too often pushed into the servants' corridor of the story. African nations boycotted the tournament because of the qualification system. They objected to a structure that did not offer Africa a direct place at the finals, forcing its representatives into a path they considered unfair. That matters. Not because it changes who won the final. It does not. It matters because it shows the world behind the World Cup. The tournament was already global in language, global in ambition, global in spectacle. But power inside football, like power inside old houses, did not distribute itself evenly just because the invitations looked formal. Some countries arrived as guests. Others had to argue for the right to be seen. There it is again, the room. Who stands in the center? Who waits outside? Who is asked to be grateful for a smaller doorway? The official story of 1966 prefers the clean line. England hosted, England won. She presented the trophy. He lifted it. The nation remembered. But the archive is less obedient. It keeps the awkward items. It keeps the stolen trophy. It keeps the boycott. It keeps the first mascot. It keeps the replay. It keeps the strange little failures that make a grand event human. Not the sort of details that survive because they flatter the official portrait. The sort that survive because they disturb it. And then there is the White City match, when Uruguay and France played away from Wembley because of a scheduling conflict with greyhound racing. Think about that for a moment. A World Cup in England, wrapped now in myth and royal memory, still had to move around the ordinary machinery of the city. Not with everything was inevitable. Not everything was polished. The grand summer was full of seams. But that is how institutions survive their own disorder. They learn which seams to light and which ones to leave in shadow. By the time the tournament reached its final day, the machinery had done its work. The cameras were ready. The public had been trained to watch. The mascot had smiled. The stolen trophy had returned to usefulness. The political discomfort had been pushed toward the edge of the frame. Everything was in place for the photograph. Almost. Because before we return to Wembley, before we look again at the Queen, the captain, and the gold between them, there is one more thing worth placing on the table. This story is not only about who held the trophy. It is about what power does to make a moment look inevitable. And this is where I would place another file on the table. Because the video you are watching will show you how one photograph gathered football, monarchy, media, and national pride into a single frame. But the shadow of the throne goes one layer deeper. It is my psychological dossier on what power does to the people who live near it. The isolation, the fear of exposure, the family wars, the public image polished until it becomes a prison, and the quiet paranoia that enters any house built around a crown. If you want that deeper archive, you will find The Shadow of the Throne in the first line of the description and in the pinned comment. Not as a souvenir, as a key. So look at Wembley again. Same queen, same captain, same trophy. But now the gold between them has a history. It has vanished from a public exhibition. It has embarrassed the organizers. It has been found under a hedge by Pickles. It has been turned from object into relic, from prize into rescued symbol, from tournament property into a small golden survivor. And now it is in the royal box. That is the trick of the scene. It looks simple because ceremony is doing its work. England has beaten West Germany by 4-2 after extra time. Wembley is no longer a stadium in the ordinary sense. It is a throat. 100,000 voices, or close enough to feel like a single body, are pushing one sound upward into the late afternoon. On the pitch, men who had spent 2 hours inside pressure are trying to understand that pressure has turned into history. The striker has entered the permanent argument of football. The manager's plan has survived the noise. And the captain has one more duty to perform. He must climb. Not far. That is the peculiar thing. The physical distance is small. A short ascent to the royal box. A few steps. The kind of climb a man could make without thinking on any other afternoon. But history loves short staircases. They allow the whole world to imagine height. Below, the pitch, mud, sweat, working-class terraces, bodies marked by the game. Above, the people, the gloves, the protocol, the controlled smile. The old house watching the new ritual arrive. And between them, the captain. In many retellings of that afternoon, one gesture survives. The captain looks at his hands and wipes them before he reaches the leader. It is quick, almost modest, the kind of motion that could vanish if the camera were looking elsewhere. But it did not vanish. Small gestures rarely do, once history decides it wants them. I want to be careful here. We should not turn that gesture into a confession he never gave. We should not pretend to crawl inside his mind and declare what he felt with royal certainty. That would be cheap. But we can read the room, and the room is eloquent. A footballer who had just led England to the summit of the world still took a moment to present his hands correctly before receiving the trophy from his monarch. That is not nothing. It is class, it is manners, it is training. It is the invisible architecture of a country where some the people inherit rooms and others learn how to enter them without disturbing the furniture. More did not approach the queen as a supplicant. That would be wrong. He approached her as a champion, a captain, the man of the hour, the face of the team, the one chosen to receive the object the entire tournament had been built around. And yet the gesture remains. Bare hands meeting gloved hands. Football meeting crown. A man from Barking receiving the world's prize from a woman whose life had been built inside ceremony. The photograph freezes that distance and hides it at the same time. That is why it is powerful. If it were only a sports image, it would belong to football. If it were only a royal image, it would belong to protocol. But because it is both, it became something larger, a nation arranging its contradictions into a single frame. For a few seconds, everything that had been scattered across the summer came together. The stolen trophy had returned. The television cameras were watching. The host nation had won. The leader was present. The captain was worthy. The crowd was roaring. And the old question, the one Britain had carried quietly through its shrinking imperial rooms, received a temporary answer. What are we now? On that afternoon, England could say, we are still capable of standing at the center. Not forever, not everywhere, but here, in this stadium, with this captain, with this trophy, with this queen. That is what ceremony does when it succeeds. It does not erase the cracks. It lights the room so beautifully that the cracks seem, for a moment, like part of the design. The captain received the trophy. He turned. He lifted it. The crowd gave the image its sound. And the photograph began its second life. Because the match ended that day. The ceremony ended. The queen left the box. The players left the pitch. The spectators went home with voices damaged by joy. The newspapers prepared their front pages. The country began the long, pleasurable work of remembering itself at its best. But images do not leave when people leave. They remain. They wait. They become evidence for stories later generations want to tell about themselves. And that is where the real power of 1966 begins. Not in the whistle, not even in the handshake, in what happened after everyone had seen it. Once everyone has seen a thing, no palace fully owns it anymore. That is the danger of the camera. Before the image, a ceremony belongs to the people inside the room. After the image, it belongs to memory. And memory is a difficult servant. It polishes what it loves. It hides what makes the story harder to tell. It repeats the clean angle until the clean angle begins to feel like truth. 1966 became that kind of memory. In England, the World Cup did not remain a tournament. It became a reference point, a national shorthand, a year people could name when they wanted to summon a feeling. Pride, unity, summer, glory. That is rare. Countries hunger for those images. They need them the way old houses need portraits in the hall. Not because portraits tell the whole truth. They rarely do. But because they offer proof that the family was once composed, dignified, and worth preserving. The 1966 final became one of those portraits. The captain holding the trophy. The queen in the royal frame. The English captain elevated by victory, the monarch lending the moment continuity, the crowd giving it permission to become myth. And once a moment becomes myth, my dear friend, it begins to behave badly. It starts selecting. It remembers the roar more easily than the boycott. It remembers the captain more easily than the qualification dispute that kept African nations away. It remembers the trophy in Moore's hands more easily than the trophy missing from its case. It remembers England at the center and leaves the edges softer, dimmer, easier to ignore. That is not an accusation against memory. It is how memory works when a nation loves the version of itself it is found. The archives kept the footage. The broadcasters returned to it. Newspapers, documentaries, the retrospectives, football programs, museum plaques, and anniversary pieces all understood the same thing. The true image still had charge. It still worked. Decades later, the captain was not remembered simply as a defender or even simply as a captain. He became the captain, the figure through whom England's greatest football memory could be made human, calm, fair, elegant, untouchable in the public imagination in a way the trophy itself never was. That is another irony. The object had been stolen. The man became harder to steal from the story. Institutions noticed. Of course they did. English heritage would later mark his memory. Wembley would hold him in bronze. Football would continue returning to Moore not only because of what he did on the pitch, but because he looked, in memory, like the kind of man a country prefers to believe represented it at its best. Controlled under pressure, modest in triumph, respectful before ceremony, strong without vulgarity. That is an attractive national self-portrait. Almost too attractive. And the Queen's presence helped frame it. She did not score. She did not coach. She did not play. But she stood at the ceremonial point where private victory became public inheritance. That is a precise kind of power, not command, placement. The crown did not need to own football to benefit from standing beside football when the country loved it most. The photograph allowed monarchy to appear not above the people, but adjacent to their joy. Close enough to bless the moment, distant enough to remain untouched by the sweat that created it. That distance is part of the design, and it is part of why the image endured, because everyone in it could be read generously. The captain as hero, the Queen as continuity, the trophy as prize, Wembley as altar, England as center, a perfect arrangement. But the archive, if you let it breathe, keeps murmuring. It reminds us that the World Cup had already been marketed, televised, disputed, delayed, stolen, recovered, branded, politicized, and then purified into memory. That purification is the real afterlife of the photograph. The event becomes simpler every time it is retold. Not false, simpler. And simple stories travel farther. That is why, when people speak of 1966, they often speak as if the whole summer had been waiting only for that final ascent to the royal box. As if everything before it had been preparation. As if the photograph was not one selected angle among many, but the meaning of the entire tournament. The palace knows this instinct well. So do nations. So does television. Find the image that contains the emotion, and the rest of the archive will be asked to stand quietly behind it. For a long time, that is what happened. The trophy in the Queen's hands, the captain receiving it, the captain lifting it, the country remembering, and beneath the frame, the smaller questions, still alive, still inconvenient. Who was allowed into the story? Who was pushed to the edge? What did Britain need that afternoon, beyond a football victory? And what did the crown gain by being there when the answer appeared? Those questions did not ruin the image. They deepened it. Because every powerful photograph has two lives, the one it offers willingly and the one it reveals only after the room has gone quiet. I do not dislike the photograph. Let us be honest about that. There is beauty in it. There is discipline. There is a kind of national theater that even I, who have spent a life watching rooms pretend to be calmer than they are, can admire. The leader does her part. The captain does his. The trophy gleams. The crowd gives the moment its thunder. It is a powerful image because it deserves to be powerful. But power is never only in what an image shows. It is also in what an image makes easier to forget. And this photograph made several things easier to forget. It made it easier to forget that football, the game being crowned that day, did not belong naturally to royal boxes. It belonged to the people who paid at the turnstiles, argued in pubs, worked all week, and treated Saturday as a small republic of noise. That matters, because when the Queen handed the trophy to the captain, the crown was not simply honoring the people's game. It was placing itself inside the people's joy at exactly the moment that joy became historic. That is not villainy. It is survival. There is a difference. A monarchy that cannot stand near popular emotion eventually becomes furniture. Beautiful, perhaps. Expensive, certainly. But furniture all the same. The Queen understood, or at least the institution around her understood, that the crown survived the 20th century not only by being old, but by appearing useful inside modern feeling. Weddings, coronations, broadcasts, jubilees, funerals, and, yes, great sporting afternoons. A crown does not have to control the match if it can appear. At the moment the match becomes memory. That is the first cost hidden in the portrait. Joy becomes available. For institution. The second cost is class. More's ascent to the royal box is often remembered as pure honor. And it was honor. But it was also a crossing. A man from Barking, from outside the old vocabulary of title and inheritance, climbed toward a woman who embodied that vocabulary completely. The beauty of the image is that he arrived as champion. The ache of the image is that he still had to arrive correctly. That is why the hands matter. Bare hands, gloved hands, one pair marked by the game, one pair protected by ceremony. The trophy passes between them, and for 1 second the country can pretend those two worlds have been reconciled. But a photograph cannot reconcile a class system. It can only catch it behaving politely. The third cost is the edge of the frame. The boycott by African nations does not sit comfortably beside the photograph, so memory tends to leave it outside. It complicates the clean story of a world gathered in England to celebrate football. It reminds us that global sport was already negotiating power, access, and representation long before the language became fashionable. Again, the point is not that the final did not matter. It mattered deeply. The point is that an image can be true and incomplete at the same time. That is where lazy history fails. It thinks a beautiful image must either be worshipped or exposed as false. No. The better question is, what did the beautiful image cost? In this case, it cost complexity. It cost the awkwardness of the stolen trophy. It cost the politics at the edge. It cost the working-class texture of football, polished into royal ceremony. It cost the strange anxiety of a country trying to feel central, while the world was teaching it how to become smaller. And perhaps that is why the photograph lasted. Not because it solved those tensions, because it suspended them. For a few seconds, Britain could look at itself and see a version that did not need explaining. The Queen was there. The captain was there. The trophy was there. The crowd approved. The cameras confirmed it. A nation loves nothing more than an image that lets it stop arguing with itself. But that pause always ends. The match becomes archive. The roar becomes recording. The trophy becomes vulnerable again to time, theft, decay, and rumor. The captain becomes statue, memory, symbol. The Queen becomes part of a longer reign, carrying many such images into the public imagination. And the photograph remains on the table, still elegant, still useful, still not telling the whole truth. So my verdict is this. The moment was a triumph of football, yes. It was also a triumph of royal placement. And those two truths do not cancel each other. They make the image dangerous. Because the most powerful portraits are not the ones that lie. They are the ones that tell just enough truth to make the silence around them look natural. And now, my dear friend, we are almost at the last door. The trophy had vanished once. The photograph did not. That is the strange ending of this file. Objects are fragile. Even sacred ones. They can be stolen from exhibitions, hidden under hedges, guarded poorly, recovered by accident, lifted in triumph, locked away again, touched by hands that become old, and passed into histories that pretend metal is more permanent than men. But images have a different life. They do not need a locked case. They need repetition. A photograph survives because people keep asking it to carry what they cannot carry themselves. And for England, the photograph of the monarch. Handing the Jules Rimet Trophy to the captain carried a great deal. A victory, yes. A captain, certainly. A monarch, of course. But also a wish. The wish that the country could be whole for one afternoon. The wish that class could climb a staircase and be applauded at the top. The wish that a shrinking empire could still stand in the center of the world without having to explain what had been lost around the edges. That is why the image still breathes. Not because it is simple, because it allows people to remember simplicity. There is a difference. I imagine the room after the ceremony, not the stadium. The room, programs folded, chairs pushed back, a glass set down and forgotten, a corridor briefly empty after too many important people have passed through it. Somewhere, perhaps, a steward collecting what the public will never see. The small debris of history after the official photograph has already escaped. We clean the room after history has made a mess of it. That is one of the privileges of service. You see what remains when the applause leaves. And what remained after 1966 was not only joy, it was an image powerful enough to outlive the afternoon, but not honest enough to carry the whole room by itself. No image is. She handed the trophy. The captain received it. England lifted it. The world watched. And somewhere between the gloved hands and the bare hands, football became more than a game for a moment. It became a stage where monarchy could touch of the people without stepping down entirely, and where the people could see one of their own climb toward the old symbols without surrendering the victory that brought him there. So was it a coronation? In one sense, yes. But not only of the captain. Not only of England, not only of football, it was the coronation of a photograph, a picture that gave a country the version of itself it wanted to keep. And perhaps that is the real reason we still return to it. Not to learn the score is settled. Not to ask whether England won. England won. We return because the image still asks something more uncomfortable. When power stands beside joy, who is borrowing from whom? Tell me, my dear friend, on that afternoon at Wembley, did the crown honor football? Or did football lend the crown one of the last perfect rooms it would ever enter? If that question stayed with you, leave it below. Did the crown honor football that day? Or did football give the crown a room it could never have built alone? I want to read your answer, my dear friend, because this archive is better when the witnesses speak. And if you want to keep a place inside these closed rooms, the shadow of the throne is waiting for you in the first line of the description and in the pinned comment. Not as a recap of this episode, but as a private dossier from the same world. The crown, the image, the fear, the silence, and the price people pay to stand near power. Subscribe if you wish to be here when the next door Share this file with someone who still believes a photograph tells the whole truth. And remember, the trophy was handed over in public. But the cost of that crown was never meant to be seen from the stands.